皆さんこんにちは。
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
それではこれより気候変動イニシアティブ JCI
We'd like to start the seminar on Europe's strategy for competitiveness, energy security, and decarbonization, implications for Japan, sponsored by JCI.
まずは日英同時通訳の
We have simultaneous interpreting today between Japanese and English.
日本語はチャンネル1
Channel 1 is for Japanese, Channel 2 is for English. So please select the appropriate channel.
それでは改めまして皆様本日は
Once again, we'd like to thank you very much for coming.
本日の進行を務めます気候変動イニシアティブ事務局の
From JCI, from the Secretariat, my name is Tanaka, and I'll be your moderator.
気候変動への対応
Responding to climate change, ensuring energy security, and enhancing economic competitiveness are
両立しているのかは
three priorities that Japan and Europe share to make sure that all are compatible.
規制作りを通じて
Europe, through policies and through regulatory frameworks, has significantly influenced corporate management, investment decisions, and global supply chains. Today, we will explore how Europe has addressed these challenges, what lessons Japan can learn from Europe's experience, and how Japan and Europe can further strengthen their cooperation going forward.
本日は駐日欧州
We are especially honored to welcome His Excellency Mr. Jan-Erik Paquet, Ambassador of the European Union to Japan, who is concluding his term of office. In addition to delivering the keynote address, Ambassador Paquet will join us for the panel discussion and Q&A session, providing a valuable opportunity for us to hear his insights. Here's today's program.
本日はパケ大使の総合演説を
After the keynote speech by Ambassador Paquet, we will be conducting discussions with experts. As for the Q&A session, we will have those in this hall use an online tool so that we may entertain questions. And we expect to conclude the session at 5 o'clock. As for the program and the profiles, on the screen you see a QR code. Today's program and profiles of the speakers can be obtained. So please make use of this QR code. And as for the video and for the information from this conference, we will announce later on how that may be made available to you. As for the way questions are submitted, we will be entertaining questions online. If you look at the QR code on the right, that is what you should be scanning using your mobile phones. During the event, you can submit questions at any time. Please keep your questions concise and keep your questions to one per section. And the question can be submitted either in English or Japanese. Due to limitations in time, we will not be able to entertain all questions. We ask for your kind understanding. Do you think you can scan this? As for the method by which you should be submitting questions. When you scan this, you will see a screen like the one you see on the left. When you tap where it says type your questions, there'll be a section for submitting questions. And so please write your questions and send.
それでは早速基調講演に入ります
We'd like to start with the keynote speech. We have a keynote speech by Mr. Jan-Erik Paquet, the Ambassador of the European Union to Japan. Since 2022, he has been ambassador, and before that, he was Deputy Secretary General and Director General for Research and Innovation, Deputy Secretary General of the European Commission, and Director General for Research and Innovation. He has played a leading role in shaping EU policy for many years, making significant contributions for advancing European Green Deal and promoting research and innovation to address societal changes. In July, Ambassador Paquet will conclude his assignment in Japan. And it is a great privilege to welcome him at this important moment as he brings his tenure in Japan to a close. So over to you, Sir Ambassador Paquet. The floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, partners. It's a real pleasure to join this afternoon at the invitation of Kato-san. Thank you very much for that, and of the Climate initiative of the Japan Climate Initiative and its many members. Thank you very much for joining in numbers this afternoon. It's for me a real honor and frankly a great opportunity at indeed the end of my 4-year term here in Japan to share with you some considerations of how the European Union and Japan are working on this complex agenda, reconciling climate, energy policies, but also our economy and competitiveness and our industrial policy, a challenge in Japan and certainly a challenge in the European Union as well. I'm also very happy to have the opportunity to speak on the subject. It has been a subject which is at the heart of the partnership between Europe and Japan with our Green Alliance, a subject, as was now just mentioned, which I also covered quite in depth, both in policy making, but also in terms of technological developments and science in different responsibilities in Brussels. Therefore, a subject which is also one which is very close to my own interest. I was about to say expertise, that's too strong. My own interest. It's a subject which I covered very often during the 4 years here in Japan. There is, I think, as said, a lot happening between us. There's also great interest with many actors in Japan. I must say I probably spoke on climate twice or 3 times a month in 22, 23 and 24. A bit less often since. Not that the subject is less relevant or less important, but it's also true to say that the overall geopolitical situation, the security challenges for Japan and for Europe has also put defense, security, defense industries very much at the center of the work of the European Union Embassy and the work with Japan. Not entirely connected, but also relevant in that broader discussion. Let me start with noting that the climate crisis is intensifying. I think we all know it. We all can experience it. I was in Europe in June, in Brittany, which is the coolest part of France, and I had 43 degrees in the shade for several days, something which was completely unheard of. The first heat wave was already in May, and that one was the most acute one experienced in France and then in most of Western Europe in the following weeks. The last 3 years have been the hottest on record. The 11 last years have been the hottest on record worldwide. And I think you all know that we have exceeded during the last 3 years the 1.5 degrees of global warming. When you look at science and monitoring of emissions worldwide, it's clear that the 1.5 degrees of the Kyoto Protocol is now moving a little bit beyond our reach. What remains possible is certainly 2 degrees, not percent, but degrees. But as we see the impact of 1.5 degree today, I think the urgency to adequately invest in climate mitigation and in decarbonization policies to stay within these 2 degrees is more pressing than ever. I think that's very much the agenda in Japan. It's obviously very much the agenda and the trajectory as we speak in the European Union. I'm afraid I can't say that for all other partners around the world, and they are, of course, very worrying political developments, not always in terms of energy deployment, which is a reason for hope, but in terms of policy deployments, notably, of course, in the US. Now, that's the climate emergency as we know it and as we have to deal with it. But beyond that climate emergency, here in Japan, also in Europe, governments, businesses, but I think also citizens more generally, we are really addressing the fundamental question of how we can effectively respond to that climate emergency, but still maintain the fabric of our societies, our competitiveness, ensure that we create growth, allowing also economic value to then invest back into climate, strengthen energy security, all of that at the same time. These are objectives which are well identified in the policy discussion here in Japan, in Europe as well. They were traditionally discussed separately competitiveness was essentially an economic security, an economic policy discussion. Energy was largely considered as a geopolitical concern, and climate action was rightly, but in a limited way, looked at from the environmental lens. Today, these issues are obviously deeply interconnected. Decisions which we make about energy systems affect our industrial competitiveness. Climate policies influence investment decision. Technological innovation shapes economic performance and emission trajectories. And as a result, governments at all levels, in global governance, but particularly at national and regional level, need to integrate strategies rather than pursue distinct, separate policy agendas. I think that is well identified in Europe. I would even argue, I'll come back to it in a moment, that the European Green Deal, which was put forward now 7 years ago in 2019, was perceived or presented largely as a climate and environmental roadmap, and a very ambitious one, of course. But it was also from the outset presented by the European Commission, and I still remember presenting the Green Deal in Silicon Valley back in 2019 as Europe's innovation and growth strategy. So already then it was clear that this Green Deal would also shape a technological and economic agenda, bringing Europe into the future. I think the starting point was that climate change represents not only an environmental challenge, but also a profound economic and societal challenge that requires long-term strategic responses. And as said, the Green Deal established the direction of travel, with Europe setting climate neutrality as an objective by 2050, like Japan. But with one important difference is that we decided then to also put in place a climate law, which is today fully in force, which would establish intermediary binding a target, including a 55% reduction of emission by 2030. And it is this intermediary target which has also driven much of the momentum in bringing forward very ambitious regulatory agendas for energy systems, for mobility systems, for industrial setups, allowing indeed to credibly move towards these very significant reduction by 2030, with an emission trading system at the heart of the setup. Now, how do we reconcile the cost of that transition with the implications for our economy, and more particularly for our industries? What has also been very strongly debated in Europe, and particularly in the last 2 years, and you're following it very closely here in Japan, and those of you representing Japanese companies are sometimes part of that discussion in Europe. Certainly you're part of these discussions here in Japan, is how can we ensure that these frameworks which drive change, which also disrupt patterns of industrial production and the organization of our energy systems, how do you ensure that this does not disrupt competitiveness? How do you ensure that this also creates technological innovation and therefore can be reconciled with economic and social policies? This is a really complicated discussion in Europe, and I don't think I can, and I certainly don't want to, hide that this is a very difficult political discussion. There has been very significant political level discussion and pushback on the European Green Agenda and on the regulatory framework put in place in the last 6 years. The elections to the European Parliament in 2024 brought with it a quite significant change in the center of gravity of majorities in the European Parliament, which with less weight on the social and green side of the European Parliament. They are still very much in a working majority, so still part, of course, of the efforts to shape the policy agenda, but with many more conservative voices across the spectrum, which put competitiveness, the economy, much more to the forefront and are less immediately being pushed in terms of their political choices, because politics is about making choices, by climate and environmental urgencies and priorities. What also is happening at the same time in Europe, more than in Japan, is that the choices we have made on energy efficiency, for example, on appliances for heating and cooling of buildings, are now impacting also citizens on a daily basis. Investments need to be done, costs need to be faced. Of course, very often member states and cities are providing support for citizens for that transition and these investments. But however, everybody is now today also facing the immediate cost around him or herself of these changes brought about by legislation and, of course, brought about by the need to transform our energy and emission setups. All this means that today in Europe we are confronted with a much more complex policy context within which it is absolutely critical that we reconcile these three main objectives: energy security, competitiveness and industrial policy, and climate ambition. I think I should here pause a second and say that we remain fully committed, again, bound by law, by the climate law, to reduce emissions by 55% in 2030. Essentially, we're on track, which is in itself quite a remarkable achievement, also against these political complex discussions. But we are on track because many of the investments needed to get us to this 55% reduction have taken place in the last few years. The European trading system is fully in place. There are still quite some volumes of free allowances, but also increasingly a very, very large degree of allowances which are auctioned and which need to be acquired at a cost to continue to emit. And this is in itself driving also changes and a much more efficient use of a carbon-based energy system across many industries. Changes are also occurring in heavy industries, changes are occurring in transport, and changes are also occurring in what we call hard-to-abate sectors or effort-sharing sectors like agriculture, for example, where changes are also progressively taking place. So we remain essentially on track for this 55% reduction by 2030. Now, when you look at it from the point of view of change management, of deployment, of technological disruptions which will still be necessary to get to climate neutrality, the Commission, and this has in the end been agreed also across the European system, it appeared very clearly a year and a half ago that if we don't set an intermediary reduction objective for 2040, it would be very difficult for companies, for local government, including at national level, to do the necessary change and investments in good time for that neutrality to take place by 2050. We have therefore set an intermediate target of a 90% reduction by 2040, which is also, particularly remarkable against this broader political background, admittedly with a degree of flexibility. Some offsetting will be possible. Carbon credits can also be exported, which was not the case before. And we also are now putting a much greater focus on not just reducing emission, but also on carbon capture and storage. So with all these additional measures which were not at the center of the policy, of the climate policy mix so far, Europe hopes to be able indeed to work towards these 90% reduction by 2040. So we'll see the next ambassador and the ambassador after him will be able to take stock with you in 2033, 2034 and see how much has been done and whether we are on track. But the overall setup is really continues now to be discussed in that perspective: 55% now, 90% by 2040, neutrality with a large degree of carbon capture by 2050. These discussions are, of course, now taking place, as said, with a very interesting energy and industrial background. We are trying to reconcile it. On the energy side, to begin with, I think many of you know, but this is, I think, really important to explain, and we'll discuss it in the panel, I'm sure, that Europe's energy policy and Europe's energy security is essentially largely based on renewables, energy efficiency, nuclear, low carbon, nuclear electricity, and then, of course, also proper strategies of storage and alternative sources of fossil fuels, particularly LNG. You know that in 2022, Russian gas became either unavailable or at least unreliable overnight with the Russian war of aggression on Ukraine. And we have been able to move from more or less 40% of gas in Europe coming from Russia to today less than 10%, and we will completely phase out Russian gas in the next few months. The same for oil, which is today at, I think, 4%. The same for coal, which has been entirely phased out. And this has been made possible by earlier investment in renewable energy, earlier investment in investment preparation, planning decisions which allow to accelerate deployment of solar and wind in particular, a continued investment in our electricity grid, and today we have more than 70% of Europe's electricity which is low or zero carbon, 50% renewable, the remaining a bit more than 20% nuclear. So it's really less, it's 28% of Europe's electricity which is still fossil-based, and this continues to decrease. Investments in renewable will continue to accelerate as we move forward. We will have this week in the Commission an additional electricity package under which we hope to on the one hand, fine-tune our electricity markets to make them more efficient, promoting low-carbon electricity. We will continue to invest in our grid. That is a major challenge, not just in Japan, certainly in Europe as well. There are some deployment of renewable which are delayed because of lack of grid connection or grid capacity. I think this is a major challenge. So there will be a policy initiative on Europe's grid development, and we will also have in that package a number of measures and policy frameworks to accelerate the electrification of sectors which are today essentially relying on fossil fuels, construction, steel, transport, amongst many others, are starting to look at electrification, but we hope to, with that electrification package, to really accelerate. We have, if you look at our overall energy system, so not only electricity, but the overall system, broadly half of it is low carbon energy. So meaning that the other half remains fossil energy. So there's still quite some work to be done also in Europe, and that electrification package, but a number of other measures is also looking at it. I think it's fair to say that these efforts of the last 5 years, of course, based on our climate energy policy of the last decades, has also allowed Europe to deal with the Hormuz crisis quite effectively. Obviously, prices, fossil prices, oil prices in particular, have also had impact on Europe. But in terms of availability, also with strategic reserves, like Japan, we have been able to essentially withstand the shocks of that energy crisis. Let's see how this develops in the next weeks and months and the foreseeable future. But I think the Hormuz crisis, and I can say it very clearly, is yet another strong illustration that the way forward on energy security is indeed to move not away, but to increase the share of non-fossil energy component in our energy mixes. In that context, obviously, nuclear and renewables are those which are today immediately available. Next to energy is, of course, also the industry. Many of you are representing Japan's industry. Many of you certainly are cooperating with European partners. I hope that many of you have invested also with Europe or in Europe. And it is today very clear that if we are to continue that ambitious climate mitigation agenda, we will also need to upgrade our competitiveness and ensure that we have frameworks in place for an ambitious clean tech industrial policy. That's a much larger issue than just climate. In Europe, as is the case in Japan, we have demographic challenges. We have challenges of competitiveness and productivity. You are possibly familiar with the Draghi report of 2 years ago, which really looked at that for Europe and analyzed where the limits and obstacles are in Europe, which explain the productivity gap with other partners, of course, particularly the US, but also the competitiveness gap with China, one which is increasingly visible also on clean technologies, a challenge in itself. I'll come back to it. And the Draghi report, of course, noted that prices of energy, in part set by climate policies, but in part only, were one element of our productivity challenge, but that the lack of integrated capital markets, the lack of a fully functioning EU internal market, that the issue of innovation were probably much more important factors lying behind Europe's productivity and competitiveness challenge. I also met recently, and I want to share that here. I met recently an economist from the European Central Bank, who was visiting his counterparts here in Tokyo, and we had this discussion, and he shared with me an interesting insight, which you possibly know as well, that if you compare productivity in Europe and in the US, or in Japan, in Europe, and in the US, of course, the US always appears as being at least one order of magnitude ahead of all the others. But if you discount Silicon Valley, to just put out the California data, and you keep the rest of the US, they are not ahead of anybody else. So in the reality of Japan's competitiveness, Europe's competitiveness, our industrial standing is certainly in a place where there are very good reasons to believe that we can build from it and also ensure that with proper policies, proper investments, bold decisions of boards and leadership of companies, that we can continue to maintain relevant industries, and with these industries also create the value necessary to preserve our societies and the fabric of our societies. Demography being, of course, a key challenge there. So Europe's clean tech policy, Europe's industrial policy is now very much focused in having climate policy frameworks and regulation as a starting point, but then working from there, looking at investment instruments, looking at new technologies, looking at partnerships, frankly, particularly with partners like Japan, to work on our competitiveness. I mean, this is in part a challenge which is sometimes discussed as existential, and this is largely because of the pressure coming from China. We have a large trade deficit with China, that's one thing, but we also see the impact on our industries, the car industry particularly, in Europe, and that is therefore one reason also why European policymakers and our citizens are so keen that proper industrial policy are deployed. Now, the discussion is in Europe is our climate policy the reason why we can't deal with these pressures? We will maybe discuss it in the panel, but let me share it here already. You have many in Europe which believe that the European emission trading system is one of the reasons why our industries are so challenged and sometimes failing to compete globally. And you have several European Union member states which are promoting a change of the ETS system with delayed application of the system to new sectors, with greater availability for a longer period of time of free allowances to ensure that indeed sectors like the energy sector, steel, those sectors which rely on fossil industries more than others can indeed still have some breathing space, and that the cost of the ETS does not come on top of the cost of energy for these sectors. Now you have very many other member states which believe that this is the wrong way forward, and that on the contrary, the industrial future of Europe lies in these clean tech industries. Also makes the case that the ETS promotes efficiency, and that's well documented, and also argues that the auction of ETS allowances is producing tens and hundreds of billions of euros, which are invested back into transitions for relevant industries. So there is also, of course, a cost, but the cost and the price of these emissions is under the ETS framework reinvested back at EU level through our innovation fund, but also largely at national level into these industries to accelerate their clean tech transformation. So it's a debate which is now starting in Europe. Of course, the Hormuz crisis and the prices of energy, even if oil is now down again to $70, $80 a barrel, are also part of the political pressure under which some governments are pleading for these delays on the ETS system. My own reading of the situation is that we will most likely, by and large, be able to maintain the trajectory of the ETS system. Again, it's a very central feature of the climate pass, the emission reduction path, which is mandatory under Europe's climate legislation. So it's a strong basis, but also because, as said, there are many actors in Europe which have already invested in cleaner industries, which see their competitiveness and their future in those investments and see the ETS framework as an important part of it. Let me finish by a couple of considerations on strategic autonomy or economic independence. Very central also in Japan's growth strategy as it will be presented by the Takaishi administration these days. Very much at the center of Europe's economic and industrial policy as well, as I'm sure you all know. So the concept is essentially that we need to ensure that the dependencies under which we operate, and energy is a key dependency here in Japan, more than in Europe, that this is addressed, but that we don't replace this dependence on fossil energies by other dependencies on clean tech, and particularly on critical raw materials. And that, I think, is also a major component of our industrial policy as we deploy it, one which is also extremely important in the work between Europe and Japan, as with JOGMEC and your very complete stockpiling and monitoring system, where Japanese companies are key actors of. You are certainly ahead of the Europeans in terms of creating such a system, in terms of your resilience. You're, of course, also right now under more pressure from China directly than we are, but that is, I think, also a particularly important aspect of the climate, energy, industrial policy setup on which Europe and Japan can work together. And I finish with one topic which is one which I am well known for in Tokyo, which is science, research and innovation, and Europe's research program Horizon Europe. Here again, these transformations and also their credibility, their cost, the mitigation of the impact will in part, and in fact largely, be carried by technology, by our capacity to develop new technology, of course also by our capacity to adequately deploy these new technologies. Horizon Europe's research program is 100 billion plus euros. It's a big program. Most of it, more than half of it, is focused in these key areas, from agriculture to energy, transport, aviation, construction, steel, under which Europe's industry, with European funding, also with strategic involvement of European government, are working on this research and industrial deployment agenda. Horizon Europe is now available to Japan. I hope that Japan will join the program from the outset in 2028 as we renew it. But with that, we also have a particularly powerful platform to work together on that innovation, industrial competitiveness agenda, maybe also investing together in the materials which will reduce our dependencies of China in critical raw earths and minerals. So, sorry, this went a bit all over the place. I hope this made kind of sense. However, I'm much looking forward to now discuss it, because I gave you the policy pitch seen from the point of view of the European ambassador. There are many, many aspects which are really challenging, including for my teams and myself. I hope you will bring them forward so that we can now also discuss them. Thank you very much.
Paquet 大使ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much, Ambassador Paquet. Now we would like to move into panel discussion. I would like to ask the panelists as well as the moderator to come up on the stage.
オンラインで質問を受け付けております。すでにいくつかいただいております。ぜひ随時思いついた段階で質問をご投稿ください。本日ご登壇いただきますのはパケ大使に加えまして自然エネルギー財団研究員のゴト
Aside from Ambassador Paquet, we have Goto from the REI and Mr. Harada, the head of CDP Worldwide Japan. And the moderator is Ms. Konishi from WWF Japan. So, Ms. Konishi, can I hand over to you? Thank you. Ambassador Paquet, thank you very much for the wonderful the keynote speech. Since Ambassador Paquet has already given keynote speech, I would like to turn to the two experts to give us some food for thought, starting with Mr. Eric Goto from REI, who is an expert on decarbonization on steel as well. So please.
いただきました。
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. My name is Eric Goto, researcher at Renewable Energy Institute. As you can gather from my name, I'm a mixture of Japanese blood and European blood. So we have two Erics on this table. That's quite unusual. I look forward to conducting this discussion. My research topic is decarbonization of steel, for one thing. Among the heavy industries, that is what I'm looking at. The other main topic is today's theme, Europe's industrial policy and climate change policies. Ever since my graduate school days, I have been pursuing this topic. I would like to make 3 points in my presentation using my slides. First of all, to review what Ambassador Paquet has said. And this is a diagram of what he has said. In 2019, the European Green Deal started. Climate change countermeasures. That was the first step in this direction. It was a really ambitious first step. And the base of this is what is written here, Europe Climate Act 2050 to achieve climate neutrality. To achieve that, this is a legal mandate, so it has to be achieved. Intermediary goal is 230, 50%, 90% in the ultimate end. And in 2090, ETS and CBAM and renewable energy expansion is being forwarded. A policy package is included in the deal. Aside from climate and energy, and I believe this will be touched upon by Harada-san, sustainability report. And the Circular Economy Action Plan. This has been formulated. The circular economy itself, to transfer that from the circularity concept is what is included. And there's the energy crisis. And there was the Trump second term, which began. And between U.S. and China, competition intensified. And within this backdrop, as has been introduced earlier, the Draghi report came out. The Draghi report, after it came out, the respective national governments have read this, and policymakers read this, and they saw this as a diagnosis. There were some points which were rather harsh and stringent, but all of the countries reflected on this point. And after the elections, the second von der Leyen period started, and policy package came out, which was the Clean Industrial Deal. And compared to the EU Green Deal, perhaps this is less familiar to the audience, especially the Japanese audience. We don't hear the Clean Industrial Deal very often in Japan, and you might wonder what this is. Broadly speaking, the Green Deal put out policies and rules, but then how the rule is to be fed into investment, and how that is fed into technology development, and how that will foster industry, heavy industries and other industries, is what is articulated in the Green Industrial Deal. So it's in the implementation stage at the moment. And the Draghi report and the Clean Industrial Deal are such that it clearly states that decarbonization would be the base. That would be the driving force for future industrial policy, and it has to be the driving force. And that is the policy of the EU. That's the second point I wish to mention. Decarbonization relatively strengthens energy security, but whether and decarbonization, whether to choose, what to choose between energy security and decarbonization and competitiveness, it's not something which is separate. It has to be pursued together. And increasing renewable energy and energy conservation to move ahead with that, pushing electrification, and to reduce dependency on fossil fuels. And as a result of that, price fluctuation will be alleviated, and decarbonization investment will be fed into new technology and new innovation. And so innovation is the key word here. And perhaps in the later panel discussion, innovation and horizon are what we would like to discuss. And between Japan and the EU, how can we cooperate? We may demand the EU and Japan to cooperate, but the specifics have to be mentioned. We have to provide the specifics so that companies know how to engage, because they're struggling as to how to go about it. There are 3 points in relation to this. A common yardstick is necessary, first of all. What is low C, and what leads to decarbonization in terms of technology? The standards have to be put in place. Recently discussed is the eco-design regulation. Product carbon footprint based low C standard is what they are working on, and Japan should very actively engage in this effort. And secondly is joint research and demonstration, and thirdly is advanced markets in the EU. They call it the lead market, to create the lead market. The importance of this is being questioned at the moment. And the last point is Japan's manufacturing technology, and these are technologies that lead to low C. We have a lot of technology available to bring this about. What is often said is that Japan has won in terms of technology, but they're losing on the market. Unfortunately, this is being said. So Japan's strengths and Europe's strengths should be leveraged so that we can shape the market. We can leverage Europe's strength to shape the market so that Japan's technology can win. We should take the perspective of leveraging and harnessing the market by doing so. And this is the very final point of what is required of Japanese companies is to respond to EU rules, but in terms of rule making and market formation, there should be a more positive role played by Japanese companies. Thank you very much.
はい。
Thank you. So there were diverse points being included. So later, we would like to discuss more on innovation. The Horizon Europe was also mentioned by Ambassador Paquet, and it seems that Japanese companies will be able to participate in Horizon Europe. So later, I would like to pose a question to Ambassador. Now, turning to CDP Worldwide Japan disclosure, the head of the APAC, I would like to ask Mr. Harada. He's an expert on sustainability disclosure. So please. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Harada from CDP. So I will be pleased to discuss on the issue which I'm sure are already well known to you. The CDP is managing the platform for sustainability disclosure. So based upon data disclosure, there are many insights have been gained. So let me introduce such insights. In 2025, we have made analysis into what has been disclosed by the businesses. In Europe, more than 7,000 companies have disclosed the data. And what is seen here is, of course, there are Green Deal and other programs and policies put in place. And when it comes to environment, in Europe is going ahead of the other regions. And you can see that this is also true for the businesses as well. And if you could look at the detail at your leisure later, but it seems that there are many leading companies when it comes to performance on environment are included. So the second point, what I would like to share with you is at CDP, there are programs on environment and also economic viability. We have made an analysis into the relationship between the two, and CDP have issued a report. And in 2025, there has been disclosure of data made by the companies and our analysis based upon that. And there are European companies as well as companies from the other regions. And the money spent on the responses to do with environment risk, and we have been making comparison for $1 being spent when responding to environment risk, at the maximum $7 of return is being seen. This is the result of our analysis. So you can see that many businesses are doing because of the compliance, but there are beneficial returns coming from such investments. And in addition to that, I'm sure you are already well aware that there are much impact on the environment, not just on your own operation, but looking at the value chain as a whole. So trying to engage suppliers, and there are many such European companies trying to engage their suppliers as well. And the percentage is 86% for the European companies trying to engage their suppliers, and the percentage level is higher compared to the other regions. So I have given you some of the insights gained from our analysis into the disclosed data. From now onwards, I would also like to discuss on the policies put forward by EU in the past. So let me give you some overview. I'm sure many of you already know of this, but nonetheless, let me try to rehash. As for regulations to do with information disclosure, the first thing I would like to mention is CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. For companies with a certain the level of operations are required to do the reporting. And more specifically, ESRS. On the right-hand side, based upon the ESRS, European Sustainability Reporting Standards, you need to disclose the information. You also need to acquire a guarantee from the third party or assurance from the third party. I will not go into that much of a detail, but the salient characteristic of the ESRS is double materiality must be made clear, and you need to cover the whole of the ESG. So some may be related to environment, but some information will also be related to more of a social sector. And in Japan, we are being asked to go through the SPG, but ISSB is also working with the ASRS, the IFAS, and EFRAG, who is the operator of ESRS. And IFAS and EFRAG have been able to see a high level of integration and the consistency as to what they have been doing. And that has already been well demonstrated. And this is more of a detail on ESRS. And if I may skip this. On information disclosure, I have informed you on the regulations, but disclosure is the very first step to lead to more concrete actions. And for the EU regulation, it does not end asking for just the information disclosure, but the regulation is encouraging actions to be actually taken. And CBAM is something well known to all of you, I believe. For those products being manufactured outside of the European Union, and you need to cover the differential in terms of carbon cost, where the European companies are the bearing. And also due diligence on the human rights and environment are also required under the CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and also you have the EU deforestation regulation. This is to do with the deforestation, to address the deforestation issue. And lastly, since we are an organization called CDP, so let me try to introduce to you the relationship between CDP and the EU policies. So the regulation ESRS is something I have already described, and this has been formulated by EFRAG. And CDP and EFRAG in 2023, we have concluded a memorandum of understanding. So CDP, through the partnership, is trying to make it easier for all the companies to respond to the policies and regulations. And we have been providing mapping and other tools so that the businesses are able to easily follow through. And on the forestry, the EUDR, which I have already mentioned, that there have been requirements have been put forward, the EU deforestation regulation, and the scoring for the CDP. We have tried to, as much as possible, align the process. And also, in regards to CBAM, try to ascertain what may be the emissions on product-by-product basis. So CDP is now considering how to support and assist the companies in order to comply with the regulation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'd like to deepen our discussion from this point onward. I'm sure there are many questions that you may have. We'll be covering different aspects, but please fire away with your questions. Write them down, please. First of all, Ambassador Paquet talked about the decarbonization as a baseline. International competitiveness and economic growth must be accumulated on top of this. But presently, Russia has invaded Ukraine, and there's the Hormuz closure. And so that fossil fuels, dependence on fossil fuels is a risk in terms of energy security. And ourselves, as well as the whole world, feels that. So the energy crisis, in response to that, in the EU, what kind of discussions are taking place, and how is that reflected in policies? Ambassador Paquet, could we hear from you first, please?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think the Hormuz crisis is leading us to accelerate. As I said earlier on, we have observed a high resilience of our energy system to that crisis, linked to strategic stockpiling on the one hand. Some alternative routes, of course, also opened up. But essentially, half of our energy system is non-fossil, so the exposure is in itself limited. And what was done with the Russia invasion of Ukraine continues now to be done in the context of that crisis of the last few months. We are doubling down on our low-carbon investments. I would say when Hormuz started, when was it, in March or April, when the war in Iran kicked off, I saw some traces of a debate in Japan on how can we now cope with that. And of course, in terms of stockpiling, you are certainly extremely resilient, and this has been, I think, a big part of the response here in the country. But at the outset, I was seeing some signals that this could shift the debate on renewables as one element of answer. Obviously, this is never available immediately. Deployment is a medium-term effort. But these early signals then faded away quite quickly. So, which is really in quite strong contrast, frankly, with the European Union, where the investments in solar, in wind, a renewed effort and interest, of course, also in nuclear. Very clearly, the energy crisis of 22, 23, and further developments, and now this second shock is also very much reopening discussions which were not taking place in some parts of Europe on nuclear, small modular reactors included. Hitachi is about to install the first of these small modular reactors in Poland in the coming months and few years. But the debate on reopening, extending the life of nuclear plants is taking place in several member states. So that's also an important component of the energy discussion in Europe. Not to mention the much longer discussion on fusion. I was seeing a fusion startup, Proxima, which is a European fusion startup, a very well-financed one, in line with financing which you can observe in the US, for example, which was in Japan now for discussions on their supply chain with Japanese fusion actors. That's a bit longer term. But to come back to your question, the setup which we established for Russia, energy efficiency, renewable energy, smart alternative sources and stockpiling is really now serving us well for the Hormuz crisis, with a renewed effort to deploy and complete our grid, and with that intensify the deployment of renewable energy.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much.
そして
Thank you very much for the renewables as well as nuclear. The decarbonization policies are to be doubled down. That was quite impressive. That is, there are changes and differences between Japan and the European Union. Now, about the differences between the two, Mr. Goto, how would you assess for this difference? Now, when we are trying to respond to crisis, in the short term, what can be done, and trying to mitigate the cost burden on the companies as well as the households. And we also need to think more of a middle to long-term solutions. The report has been put forward last month by the RAI. In the year 2020, when the energy crisis has started, under the Japanese energy policy, there has been emphasis placed on switching the energy, the sources that we need to boost renewables. But the report the last month has looked into, because of the Hormuz, the crisis, how has the Japanese policies been effective or not? And as Ambassador Paquet has already said, Repower EU has been put forward back in 2020, and not just substituting the energy coming from Russia, but trying to create a system so that the European Union will become a more of the self-sufficiency in terms of energy. So there has been 260 the gigawatts of the solar. So 220 gigawatts. 1 gigawatt is about one nuclear power plant. So 220 gigawatt means huge. And on the other hand, in Japan, it is mainly, as you may know already, the price subsidies. That is to say, as gasoline prices have gone up, the government has provided the subsidies. 16.3 trillion yen worth of subsidies have already been provided. And this is the result given by the simulation research by the Institute. And if we had further accelerated the heat pumps and other measures in 2026, about 20 billion yen of the fuel cost for power generation must have been saved. On the other hand, actually, the heat pump and electric vehicles, how much of subsidies have been given? 620 billion yen worth of subsidies have been provided by the government. So 13.6 trillion, of which 4% went to heat pumps as well as electric vehicles. So perhaps a structural transition must have been accelerated more, is the conclusion that we have reached.
Thank you very much. That was a simulation. But if structural transformation had been done through policy, that was the estimate which has just been announced. So that was very thought-provoking. Renewable energy and energy conservation, these are very useful for energy security. And in Europe, renewable energy promotion and decarbonization as a major factor, this is being considered. But in Japan, renewable energy, when we say renewable energy, they are experiencing adverse wind at the moment. It's thought of as being a drag on economic growth. So renewable energy, to steer in that direction is not something that we are mature enough to do. So Japan and Europe, the differences in strategies, what do you think are the differences in strategy, Ambassador Paquet? That is awareness on renewable energy. What is the difference in awareness and recognition between Japan and Europe, please?
I think it's a difficult question, and I think the question is certainly not put to today's policies. I think the difference is much older than that. I think what happened is that indeed in Europe we put at the center of our energy policy these climate commitments under the Kyoto Protocol. In the 90s, we started to set up our energy and renewable policy framework with, at the outset, a 20% reduction, which was targeted at the horizon of 2020, together with a share of renewable of 20% in electricity generation. And those targets were by and large achieved, but they were set in the 90s. So it is indeed a regulatory choice, a political choice, which was then implemented with a regulatory framework, which has led to indeed the initial large investments in grid and grid connection and deployment of renewable energy. This in turn created an industry, a highly competitive industry, today under massive pressure from China. But in the 90s and 2000, a lead industry worldwide in wind, to an extent also in solar, even if the panels, of course, were and now essentially are Chinese. Perovskite is a very small technology for now in Europe, but this then in itself provided an extremely strong basis to intensify as developments required it. So it's true that such choices need to be made over the longer term. What is also, I think, different between Europe and Japan is that there is a degree of acceptance that there is a price to pay for consumers. And subsidies for energy also exist in Europe, but in a totally different way to Japan. And the cost of gasoline, for example, will increase by 20, 30, 40% when you have a crisis like Hormuz. This is short-term increases. They are sometimes mitigated, sometimes a bit by companies, sometimes with fiscal rebates, temporary ones, but never with subsidies. So there's a little less sensitivity politically in Europe and a greater maybe acceptance politically and by the consumer of price variation, which are borne also by the consumers. And this then, of course, creates space for these limited fiscal resources to be put more into investment and less into direct consumer subsidies. But then, of course, what is the broader difference is that in Europe, until a few years ago, there was effective pressure from the electorate, from us citizens, for action to take place. That's what the Europeans wanted. The election in 2019 brought into the European Parliament a very, very large majority in favor of super ambitious climate policies. So a strong Green Party representation, but beyond that Green Party representation, the mainstream parties, the Conservatives and the Social Democrats, they had in their platforms very ambitious climate policies. So this has eroded, as I explained earlier in my keynote, to an extent. It's still the case that Europeans are perfectly clear, all of us, that climate change is happening, that we're in trouble, and that we have a responsibility to act. And that in turn, of course, also created space politically for measures which are costly and challenging, and which therefore started 30 years ago. So maybe these are some elements of differences between the policy space available for such measures.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. So the history is different, first of all, as Ambassador Paquet has just mentioned. For us citizens was the term being used. As a civil society, you also mentioned us, and that was very impressive. In case of European consumers, that they are more generous and tolerant for making greater investment when it comes to environment. And this is something we need to learn as a lesson. So Mr. Harada, you have looked at many different questionnaire surveys to do with data disclosure. So compared to Europe, is there any difference in terms of recognition for renewables in Japan? Yes, we are a CDP, so we do observe data, especially on reports. But this is a really sensitive and delicate timing, because when it comes to energy, the latest report are being put forward in 2025. So there is some time lag. But I have already discussed with the person responsible. In a few months' time, the new report will be coming out this year, and I would also like to read that report. But if I may base myself right now on the report back in 2025, for RE 100, this is a report on RE 100. So trying to go for 100% for renewables. What is the present situation for those leading companies in Japan. And when we look at such leading companies, so based upon the 2025 report, the RE100, those companies trying to go for 100% renewables compared to the previous year, the year 2024. In 2024 report, it was 25% for renewables, but it went up to 36% in 2025 report. So there has been an increase by 11 percentage points. 36% is too low, so the journey ahead is very long. But there is a steady progress. So for Japanese companies, aiming for RE100 is only about 36%, whereas in Europe it is 86%. So the situation is very different between Japan and Europe. Then why it is slow in Japan? Although there has been increase by 11%, but why is it too slow? And why is it difficult? The biggest barrier mentioned by the Japanese companies is always the cost involved. Too expensive a cost. And that seems to be the bottleneck. So for those companies joining the RE100, and there are many such companies, they do understand fully it is important to go for renewables, but there are difficulties involved. But even so, there has been a progress seen. So I am hoping to see the newest report in 2026, but I hope that already another progress has been seen.
Ambassador Paquet has mentioned since the 1990s, renewable energy, energy conservation, climate action, Europe has been steering into that direction since 1990. There's a difference in timing. In Japan, we're seeing some growth, so we look forward to seeing the next report. Thank you. But Europe has accelerated climate action to the extent that it did. Initially, Green Deal and Ambassador Paquet reviewed the Green Deal for us, and he said that we could ask anything about the Green Deal. Renewable energy policy promotion inclusive of this in Europe. They're leading in terms of decarbonization in the world, and it is without a doubt. But on the other hand, among Japanese companies, they say that rules and regulations in the EU are proving to be a burden, a considerable burden. We hear voices to that effect. So regulations and rules, when they evolve, and they continue to evolve, what kind of discussions are taking place regarding this? And how should Japanese companies interpret this constant evolvement of regulations and rules? Please, Ambassador Paquet.
Thank you very much. Maybe just one last comment on renewable energy and electricity. I think it's quite striking that in terms of market development, the cost of renewable electricity is today significantly cheaper compared to fossil electricity. I mean, it's a completely different discussion, and this is also where there is a degree of optimism which one can have globally. As deployment gets to critical size in a given energy market or system, the relative cost of electricity drops very fast. You have countries, member states in Europe, where the electricity is essentially zero carbon, and they have a competitive edge on the others. So once the grid investment is done, once the critical mass is there, the cost is on keeping fossil, not investing in renewables, and that's extremely striking. And one of the elements of this competitiveness, of this concept connecting industrial competitiveness with renewable energies, and it's demonstrated in some of our industrial ecosystems in Scandinavia or in Spain or Portugal, for example. Now, on regulation, and this is, of course, a particularly important area, certainly for bureaucrats and diplomats. That's what we do. Sometimes we like doing it maybe a bit too much. Some say that we are regulation trigger happy in Europe. There is certainly a real bit of soul searching right now in EU institutions on whether we have not pushed the complexity of some of that regulatory arsenal of the Green Deal too far. And one policy framework which is now being deployed is one labeled simplification, where we are revisiting, in particular, the reporting requirements. I think Harada-san can certainly say a bit on that as well, to ensure that whilst preserving the purpose, providing the transparency to generate company leadership in the transformation, we also reduce the unnecessary bureaucratic burden for the key companies to begin with, but also downstream, because the challenge is, I think, both for the companies immediately under these requirements, but also the requirements which they in turn then put on their supply chain actors. And essentially what we've tried to do is to not so much change the scope, or at least not the scope of the requirements, but to change the companies which are immediately affected by the legislation, in particular limiting the bureaucratic cost for smaller and medium-sized companies. Again, those immediately targeted by the regulations, but also those downstream. This is still in the legislative process. It's a complicated discussion because legislation is a challenging effort to establish. It's not so much easier to amend or to change or dismantle. So there's right now also, I think, for Europe and for you engaging in Europe, a bit of a challenge of that intermediate stage where the simplification agenda is out there, but where the discussion between member states and the European Parliament are fully ongoing, where you also have quite a few actors saying that, in fact, we broadly got it right, let's not dismantle it so much. So the discussion is also one which is very political and not yet fully conclusive. I think it's important also to say that we should not, as Europeans, apologize for regulation, and I certainly don't. In the sense, I mean, I used to be part in the commission of the better regulation system. I was, in fact, responsible for it as a deputy cabinet office secretary general. And we have in Europe a rather robust setup. We do very deep analysis as we prepare legislation, large public consultations. I mean, some of you contribute to them, and I can only encourage that. You can contribute from Japan. Obviously, you contribute even more effectively when you are actors in the European ecosystems. But then on the basis of these consultations and deep analysis, we then put forward proposals which are very well considered, but also are necessarily well considered because they need to cover 27 different national systems. And this is where regulation is necessary. It's not that we think that self-regulation is a bad thing, not at all. But self-regulation with so stark or so significant diversity of initial situations, 27 different societies, 24 languages, 27 economies, largely integrated in the internal market for some sectors, but not everywhere. This does require rules of engagement. And this is where regulation is necessary and inherent to an internal market between 27 countries, which the European Union is. Having said so, we need to ensure that we don't over-engineer it. And I admit that in some cases, you could argue that there has been a little bit of over-engineering, a little bit of lack of trust for actors to really deliver on objectives, a bit of micromanagement, and that is now being addressed, and I hope will be adequately corrected also as we move forward.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. So there has been several points, salient points been mentioned. So then Mr. Harada, as Ambassador Paquet has already mentioned, and also it is discussed inside Japan as well. Disclosure regulations seems to have been relaxed, and there have been some backpedaling, it seems. So that is the impression seen in Japan. But trying to reduce the bureaucratic burden and trying to simplify, that was the explanation given by Ambassador Paquet. So could you elaborate on this? Now, as was mentioned earlier, there has been Draghi report and other the debates, and the omnibus package that has been the norm. So for the past a couple or so years, there has been efforts trying to sort out. So simplification and trying to improve on competitiveness and trying to reduce the burden, the work burden for the businesses. So be it the UNR or CBAM, there has been some impact, but when it comes to reporting for the CSRD and ESRS, there have been also impacts and simplification has been made. So let me try to explain on this. For the CSRD, this is a regulation on information disclosure, and under CSRD, there is ESRS, sorry for the alphabetic soup, but there are such requirements. So what has changed for the omnibus package? The scope of the companies, those who are required to disclose, it has been narrowed down. And as for the targeted scope, it is based upon the sales turnover and the number of employees. Originally, it was 50 million euro was the threshold. And for those businesses having sales turnover of more than that, has been required to disclose the information. But the scope has become 450 million euro. So it has become 9 times as large. The threshold has become much higher. And the third party, the assurance, also the verification, the guarantee that was asked in full. But now it is a limited assurance. So the hurdle is lower. And for ESRS, this is a framework for disclosure. And as for ESRS, it was also simplified. So on the data points being required, about 60 to 70% reduction of the number of data points. This is what I have been told. I would become too long if I start explaining about the concrete content, but in any case, reduction and simplification has been made. And as Ambassador Paquet has been speaking of a very difficult discussion, there has been many feedbacks being made from the different sectors. And what I would like to emphasize is the target for emission reduction for the European Union. It has been legislated into law. 55% reduction by 2030 and 90% reduction by 2040. And those targets are still there. So EU is still aiming for that. But some adjustments down the road will be seen. NCSRD is encouraging information disclosure, and we need to be always be aware of that. But you need to also look at the actions that need to be taken. It is not the information disclosure for the purpose of information disclosure. The purpose is leading to the actions to be taken by the companies. So you need to prioritize. When it is absolutely necessary, data should be disclosed. But if it is less in importance, you don't have to allocate your resources that much. So you can make some adjustments. And that is the consequence for the companies this time.
Thank you very much for your explanation. By increasing the threshold ninefold, maybe action can be encouraged, but the goal is the same. Thank you. As Ambassador Paquet has mentioned, EU has a lot of regulations and rules, but there are 27 member countries in Europe, so rules and regulations are necessary, and it's obvious. Mr. Goto, the environmental regulation and economic development, whether to go for regulations or whether to enhance voluntary efforts. Japan tends to emphasize the voluntary. There are differences, but how should we look at this? How should we interpret this difference in approach? The difference in approach is what you're talking about. Maybe an example that's easy to understand would be the following: EU ETS. Let me talk about the EU ETS. This week, ever since the clean industry deal, EU ETS is being revised, and a draft proposal will be put out today, is from what I understand. And so what is being discussed at the moment is that 2040 reduction by 90%. That's the legal target. The Europe Climate Act, the EU ETS, how should this be applied to the Climate Act? How should it be aligned with the Climate Act? That is the base of the discussion. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I'm looking in detail at iron and steel. So once I talk about iron and steel, I might lose the audience. But why is iron and steel so important? It emits a lot of CO2, and as an industrial base, it's a basic industry, on the other hand, and it's a very important, one of the very important industries. However, hard to abate. They use a lot of coal to burn iron ore, with coal to produce iron and steel. So how do we reduce this? For the iron and steel industry, ETS is burdensome. If there is no free allowance, they will go bankrupt because they will have to pay a huge amount. That is what they are saying. On the other hand, new iron and steel companies or decarbonization technology using iron and steel companies, they feel that ETS should be retained as committed in alignment with the climate target of 1930s. The free allowance should be reduced accordingly, and that gives predictability in terms of corporate management. That is what is being said. So this week and next week, we'll see a conclusion to this debate. But if we look at Japan's GX ETS and try to compare, the Climate Act and the ETS, the connection between the two is weak. It's not feeding to NDC. Clear reduction target cap is not included. So here, there should be a top-down effort and say this is legally determined, so this has to be done. It's important to create rules and regulations and the market.
Thank you. I'm sure you would need hours and hours when we start speaking about steel decarbonization.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I certainly don't want to speak for hours on steel, but I'd be happy to just indeed complement what Eric rightly said on the ETS. I think Europe's climate policy indeed sets out a hard target, 55% reduction, 90% reduction in 2030 and 2040, but then there is a full set of instruments to achieve it. A key instrument is the ETS, which is aimed at providing hard price signals to energy-intensive industries, including progressively broadened to sectors which were not covered yet, in transport in particular. And the logic of the ETS is pretty simple, is to emit CO2 in these sectors, you need the authorization to do so, the ETS allowance. And you have two types of allowances: free allowances, they don't cost anything, so when you have them, If you have an allowance for 10 tons, which is free, you emit freely 10 tons. But these free allowances increasingly are reduced, and therefore the other allowances, they need to be acquired through an auction mechanism. And the less free allowances they are, and the more the industries continue to emit, the higher obviously the bidding, and therefore the cost of the allowance to allow you to continue to emit. So you get over time, as the free allowances reduce, and if industry does not decarbonize, you get into indeed a situation where the price signal becomes starker and starker. And so the discussion today in Europe, including because the trajectories of decarbonization of some of these industries has been slower than anticipated, both by the industry and by ourselves. The discussion is today, should we keep free allowances for a little bit longer to ensure that the price signal does not become too brutal on companies or on sectors which indeed are confronted to a technologically and economically challenging transition towards low carbon. But at the same time, if you are too benign with that, the transition continues to slow down. So that's really placing the cursor is particularly difficult. There will indeed be a proposal, as Eric rightly said, today by the European Commission. And this will kick off quite a process of legislation where the 27 member states will discuss it. As I said earlier on, many member states would want a much more benign system, less costly for industry, so give industry more time, allow it to emit emissions longer, as the transition is challenging. Others which, on the contrary, believe that we need to keep the timelines, including because of the legislation, but not only, and which say, in addition, that the ETS provides, through the auctioning system, the money to invest in the decarbonization. Because there's a big difference also between Japan and Europe, is that our fiscal space is very constrained in Europe. So it's not that we can just go on the market and put 25 or 30 billion of euros into an innovation fund, and this will be straightforward. We need to find revenues to do that, and the ETS is, from that point of view, doubly precious as a price signal, but also as a source of funding and financing for these investments. So that's the discussion on the ETS. But of course, the climate law has many other drivers: regulation on energy efficiency, targets for renewables, the Clean Industrial Deal, which Eric mentioned very well earlier on, which is financing instruments, standards, also support to joint undertakings or groups of companies which together do research and development and deployment. Also work with cities in Europe. We have a framework for climate neutral cities, which helps cities learn from one another and accelerate their transformation to reduce their emissions across all sectors of municipal and, in fact, human activities. So it's a whole set of efforts at different level by different actors with different types of obligation or support, which is necessary and prompted by these legal obligations of 20, 30, 55%, 20, 40, 90%. And this essentially tells you this is happening. It's a complicated process. It's a super complicated process. It's a politically costly process. I said the European consumers are ready for price adjustments, but they find it difficult too. In social terms, it can be very difficult for parts of society. All that is obviously at play, as is the case everywhere else. But by and large, the consensus remains that this is the target and we need to deliver on it.
はい。非常に困難な
It's a very difficult road, but to push ahead with the whole package. And in Japan, GX ETS has finally started. We're about 20 years behind Europe, or even more than 20 years behind. The instrument is finally there. And as Ambassador Paquet mentioned, the ETS is such that it not only clarifies the carbon price, but it generates revenue, which is necessary for decarbonization, money for investment. And Japan has now started, so we have high expectations now. innovation. You talked about Horizon Europe and Japan, Europe, or Japanese companies will finally engage. Japanese companies can apply for Horizon Europe. And as Ambassador Paquet has been mentioned, Japan is a very important partner for Europe. He has repeatedly said that in his keynote speech. So we share common values between Europe and Japan, and we need to deepen cooperation. So what are your expectations of Japanese companies? We'd like to ask Ambassador Paquet, and then we would like to open up to the floor for questions. So Ambassador Paquet, what are your expectations? What do you look for in Japanese companies?
No, thank you. I mean, firstly, you are obviously pioneers in engineering and technology alongside Europeans. I think the two most powerful, I mean, if I put China aside, obviously, but I think the two most powerful actors are certainly Japan and Europe, an amazing engineering culture, and also the capacity to translate that into innovative solutions which are then deployed. I think what my expectation is that we continue to do more of that together. There's a lot happening. We are extremely appreciative of the investments of Japanese companies in Europe. I mean, there are many Japanese companies which in de facto are European companies. If I take Fujitsu, for example, they are essentially a European digital company. If I take Hitachi, they're essentially Europe's #1 rail company. There are a few more, but it's a major actor of these technologies in Europe. And you have also your trading houses have invested very largely in wind energy, for example, in Europe. I think the purpose of these investments is, of course, financial. These are economic investments. You are looking at dividends and revenue, but you're also, I think, investing in Europe as a joint learning curve on which we can really progress together. And some of these lessons are then fed back in Europe. I think for wind, this is particularly visible. There is not yet a Japanese wind champion. I very much hope that this will consolidate rather earlier than later. Not that we wouldn't want to be your champion as European companies, but I think that you also need a Japanese champion, because with that, I think wind as a source of renewable energy will probably also gather much more political momentum, as there will also be industrial interests behind it. But that, I think, is really a nice illustration of how we are in it together. We were speaking earlier on of autonomy and dependencies on raw materials and minerals. I mean, this is a major challenge. Economic coercion is happening to Japan now. It was on the brink of happening to Europe a few months ago. It can come back. So we are here also, I think, in it together. The answer is obviously to be resilient, and you've been able to set up a system in the last 15 years. We will find it much more difficult, because to stockpile, you also need a bit of margin to stockpile, and the way this is now managed by China, this is really without any margin to stockpile, so this will be very difficult, which also means that it's investments in mining, in processing. Japan is investing in Europe on processing, for example, in France with Carester. We also are looking at joint investments in mining across the world, Africa, Latin America. Quite a bit, I think, can be done there. And whilst your companies, you are very significant financial actors, as we are as well, when we team up, I think we are maybe not unbeatable, but the offer is, I think, particularly interesting. So one type of work which is being done between JOGMEC and the European Commission, JBIC and the delegation, the teams in the embassy, is also to work with actors in Japan and Europe and see where business opportunities, either in Europe or together in the rest of the world in this key area, can also take place. Research will be a key dimension of it. I mean, you can see it every day when you speak to companies. Every day you have a story of, yes, I was dependent on gallium or germanium, but now I have another technology and I reduced it by 90%. And that's, I think, also largely the way to go. As is perovskite. Let's see how how large it will effectively become. But it's indeed a technology which is a Japanese technology, one where you are fully competitive and where you reduce the exposure to solar panel. There's no coercion or on solar panels. I think this is just too important for China, so I'm not immediately worried, but it's nevertheless also really important that in these technologies, homegrown industries in Japan, in Europe, hopefully together, can emerge. Research can allow that. And your scientific system is outstanding. Ours is absolutely amazing. I mean, the best science is taking place in Europe, also in Japan, occasionally in the US and China, I must admit it. But in Japan and in Europe, it's just the highest possible level, and it's combined to engineering. So I think this is where the offer which we made many years ago of having Japan part of Horizon Europe is based. Complementarity, your strengths and ours are somehow complementary. Sometimes they overlap, but even if they overlap, they get us to critical mass of excellence in science. And so doing more together in science will also produce more solutions, more innovation, new technologies, new materials. It's not easy to do. Science is never easy. It's sometimes bureaucratic. And to answer in 2 sentences to your question on companies, Horizon Europe is essentially an effort in Europe between industry and public research organizations. That's what Horizon Europe is about. We also have university-driven research, certainly, and science-driven research, but the bulk of Horizon Europe is delivered in joint undertakings and consortia which bring together industrial research capacity and public research capacity. And that is what I hope can be deployed also with Japan. This will not happen overnight. And Japan has now associated towards the end of the program. Horizon Europe runs out next year. You have joined at the beginning of this year. In fact, we will formally sign the accession of Japan on the 30th this month, in 10 days. But you already are welcome to join since the beginning of the year. You will join, there will certainly be, 20, 30, 40 projects which will emerge with Japan participation. Being in the program is not something which is formal. What does it mean? It means that when you are, as a country in Horizon Europe, as actors of that country, you are on the same footing as Europeans. So Tokyo University is like Strasbourg University. No difference whatsoever. Same eligibility, same role, same rules. And Tokyo University, if retained in a project, is not funded by Japan, it's funded by the program. So no bureaucracy there either. So it's a completely different setup to normal research cooperation, and one which has immense potential. In the next year and a half, as the program rolls out, I essentially expect, honestly, more universities and companies to find their way in the rather intricate ecosystem of the program. It's always collaborative research with 5, 7, 8, 10 actors. These teams exist in Europe already. They will increasingly find Japanese partners to join these consortia because of your excellence and complementarity. And this will progressively create full participation of Japan. Where the real potential is in the next program. So Horizon Europe will be succeeded by a new program in 28, again for 7 years. The price tag which we are proposing is nearly doubling, 175 billion euros. So it's many yens. Not sure I know how many, but a few, certainly over 7 years. But what the program, what I very much hope is that these 2 years will be perceived as a success and that Japan will decide to be there from the beginning. Why? Because it's at the beginning of the program that the most powerful structures for industry are established. Joint undertakings. We have a joint undertaking for clean aviation around Airbus and a few others, created 7 years ago. The research program is ongoing for clean aviation. We have a hydrogen joint undertaking, which is producing solutions every day for hydrogen research, but also deployment. We have a steel joint undertaking. We have a health joint undertaking. And they really are the place where industry does research together with public institutions, with a lot of public funding, but their own resources as well, but also with steering done by the European Commission and member states participating in that joint undertaking. And Japan would be welcome to become part of that. Fujitsu, for example, is in discussion to join the high-performance computing joint undertaking, which is, of course, would be a major step, possibly for Fujitsu, certainly for us as well. All that will be the discussion at the beginning of the next framework program with Canadian actors, New Zealand actors, Korean actors, Australians. India also wants to join. So my fingers are crossed, and maybe you can help to ensure that this time round Japan does not wait 6 years, but joins from the outset, because this is really then a platform where the broader discussion we are having this afternoon can be really promoted and in fact materialize. Sorry for being a bit long.
Thank you. いや、力強いこの
That was very encouraging words. So Ambassador Paquet, before leaving Japan, he was very enthusiastic in trying to form a bridge between Japan and the European Union. And invaluable hints and clues have been given to all of us who have joined the symposium. Horizon Europe, the research institutes and businesses are trying to work together under joint undertakings. These are something indispensable when we try to go for decarbonization of the society as a whole. I very much hope that many of the companies will apply for the program. Thank you, Mr. Tanaka. Thank you very much for a very active discussion. Although the remaining time has become shorter, but we would like to provide answers to the questions already received. Now you can use this QR code, and already many questions have been received, but I don't think we have enough time to give answers to all the questions. But immediately we would like to go into the question and answers, and I would like to ask Ms. Konishi to continue to moderate. Thank you very much for the many questions. This is a question for Ambassador Paquet. In the European Union, the citizens and the industries, are they supporting even more carbon pricing policies? Renewables are not costly anymore, so it would become much cheaper as their penetration becomes larger. But the integrated cost, as the percentage of renewables is improved, the electricity the prices in Germany is actually going up because the nuclear power plants and coal-fired power plants have been closed down. And in Japan, the revised GX promotion law is put in place. But what is your view on what is happening right now?
Thank you very much. I think the question came, I think, earlier in the afternoon, and I think to an extent I covered some of these aspects already. But I think there is certainly a growing understanding, a growing appetite also for the deployment of renewables. One dimension which I didn't cover at all, we haven't discussed it, but it's part, of course, of the equation, is also the exponential availability of storage, which makes renewable energy so much more relevant and also economical in many, many circumstances beyond the connections to the grid. Renewable energy will also be, I think, a big part of data centers in Europe. I think it's also part of the concept here in Japan. And for citizens, this is also increasingly seen, and there are in most member states schemes with public subsidies for deploying renewable energy on homes, be it heat pumps or solar rooftops, for example. And indeed, the cost of heating and of fossil fuels has been a particularly strong incentive for those also private considerations and private co-investments to be accelerating across Europe. So there's indeed a lot happening, not to mention that more and more citizens are also well aware that renewable energy, clean energy, in contrast to coal and oil power stations, gas is of course a bit different, are also much cleaner in terms of air quality. Electric vehicles, public transport is also a very interesting proposition. And there's a real understanding that quality of life, particularly in our cities, and we have seen the devastating heat effect in major European cities over the last few weeks. Renewable energy, but also climate mitigation solutions, trees, nature-based solutions are very much also at the forefront of the interest and of the discussions, and with that, deployment is facilitated.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much for that. The next question. This is directed to Ambassador Paquet as well as the other panelists. Recently in Japan, because of the Middle East situation and because of the entry into the energy addition age, in many of our policies, there's an effort to try to diversify fossil fuel sources, and there's the narrative that we should continue to use fossil fuels. That is reflected in our policies. To Ambassador Paquet and to the panelists, what do you think about the direction of Japan's energy industry and the climate policy in view of this fact? Could you keep your answers brief and start with Ambassador Paquet, please?
Be qualified to give you a real assessment of Japanese policies, so I will not. However, what is clear, and that is the case for Europe as well, is that fossil fuels will remain a key part of the energy mix for the years to come, and to an extent for the decades to come. Much less as we move forward to 2040, but even in 2040 and in 2050, there will be fossil energy. We will need to capture the CO2 from these emissions, but there will certainly be some niche areas where that will most likely remain a necessity. So yes, we also need proper energy strategies for fossil, but in the case of Europe, our energy security and energy policy is to really mitigate and reduce it as we move forward.
では、後藤さん。
Goto-san, please. To talk about Japan and the circumstances in Japan, fossil fuels to diversify sources would not change the fundamental structural issue. And what is often said is that the CCS, recently there's a lot of focus on CCS, but when we talk about the CCS, there's a difference between Japan and EU. Unfortunately, there is this difference which is visible. Is there places to bury when we opt for CCS? So that becomes an issue. The captured CO2, where do we bury that? To take that overseas and bury? If that is the case, in terms of energy security, there are problems with that. It is an idea that comes regarding this approach. Japan has a very little landmass, and there's a lot of mountainous land, and the sea is deep, so things are very difficult. But if we focus on the difficult points, it's not very productive. Why are things so difficult? Who is responsible, as was indicated in the previous question? Maybe it's the demonstration transmission lines, or lack of investment, or the power market reform. Maybe we should put more of an effort on this aspect. So where the responsibility lies is something that we need to identify and discern. Thank you. Harada-san, please. Yes. Mr. Goto and REI is more of an expert on this issue, but in terms of the global effort to achieve net zero is the direction. So if we don't do this, so there'll be a cost incurred in Europe. There's a heat wave, and they're in a very difficult situation. There's a cost involved with this. So aiming for net zero is economically reasonable. So in order to aim for this, what must be done? These are things that we should think about. And so with regard to this aspect, research institutions, wisdom, should be leveraged, and we want to collect ideas from you. I think we need to think hard about this issue.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. There are so many questions being received, but now turning to Ambassador Paquet. Between EU and Japan, the definition on what is a green product seems to be different. should Japan align with the EU for the definition, or should Japan lead the way for the rule making to change the situation? What would you think?
That's a very good question. Well, I think I should probably say that the European leadership is, of course, very strong, including because the market base for such products is very strong. The market is in itself 4 times bigger, but also the take-up of these goods is very high in Europe. At the same time, we are also very clear that this is regulatory work, but also international standards, which we cannot do on our own. I think there was, for a very long time, the notion of the so-called Brussels effect, when Europe was regulating for itself. I mean, essentially, given the size of the market and to an extent, technological leadership, the world would pick up the standard. And that was not untrue entirely, you know? But this is today not the case anymore, and I think we need partners to regulate together. We need to standardize, to do work on standardization together, and that certainly applies also to green products. One good example of that is work on batteries and on the digital passport for batteries. We are working on a digital passport to ensure that as batteries move into the recycling stage, there is full knowledge of what is to be done and how effectively to move on that recycling circular economy path. This digital passport is very advanced in Europe, but it's of course particularly important for Japan as well. I mean, you produce batteries, we don't. And there are extremely interesting discussions between Japan's Battery Association, ours. Your digital actors in Europe are also part of that discussion, and I think that's, for example, a good area where I'm sure we will end up with a digital passport in Europe, which will essentially work for you as well, and maybe can also then be used, maybe adjusted, but can be used in Japan as well. But we need to team up on that.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much for that. Is time up? Sorry. So we have never had a person that's so versed with regard to Japanese policies, and it's very sad for us that he is leaving. But we hope that he will continue to serve as play a bridging role between Japan and Europe. So could we have a big round of applause for Ambassador Paquet? So thank you very much to Ambassador Paquet and the panelists. The applaud doesn't seem to stop. There are many more questions. The low state of awareness of citizens was referred to in one of the questions. We're very sad that we were not able to address all the questions, but it's due to limitations in time. We'd like to move to the last part of our program. We'd like to have representative of Japan Climate Initiative, Mr. Sergio Shigeo Kato, deliver closing remarks.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I am the co-chairman of the JCI.
Ambassador of the European Union to Japan, Mr. Jean-Eric Paquet. I would like to express my great gratitude for spending your precious time just before leaving from Japan, very busy days, and also for your participation in this JCI seminar today. So we strongly express our gratitude, and it is a great honor to have your contribution and your leadership and your support on climate actions for both for Europe and also for Japan. So having listening to your message and the discussion with all panelists, I'm once again convinced that the climate action contribute to not only to decarbonization, but also to the economic growth and in competitiveness, industrial competitiveness, and also the national security, energy security, by evidence by the European leadership and the European experiences. We learned a lot. having said that, let's take on a challenge together with Europe to ensure that climate ambition or climate action is translated into economic, let's say, opportunities and strong industrial strengths and technological leadership together with Europe. Maybe optimizing Horizon Europe. Let's revisit the Horizon Europe. Maybe we set up some special seminar to run the Horizon Europe, how to participate or how to collaborate. So as a co-representative of Japan Climate Initiative, that is a non-state actors coalition, I think the expectation to the role of the non-state actors is getting stronger, together with government or together with all multilateral collaborations. So we remain strongly committed to challenge it. So please join me in giving another big proud applause to all the ambassador and all panelists again. Thank you. And last, but we all wish you a great success in your next assignment. Thank you very much. By the way, can I take a picture of this seminar with 360 cameras? I will take all of you at once. I'd like to upload these photos to the SNS. So if you don't like to be uploaded, please hide your face. This is 360, so all of you will be taken together with ambassador and the panelist. Ambassador, are you ready? Okay. Everybody ready? Okay. 1, 2, 3. Thank you very much.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. So with this, we conclude today's seminar. Thank you very much for staying with us until the very end. Thank you very much indeed.